Psychic Self-Defense by Dion Fortune. These are the last 4 chapters of Dion Fortune's classic text, Psychic Self-Defense, 1935. Methods of Defense, Part 1. In writing for the general reader an account of the methods to be used in combating a psychic attack, I am reminded of those excellent manuals upon medicine and surgery which an enlightened Board of Trade insists shall be provided for the captains of ships, together with a cupboard full of remedies, harmless and otherwise. When an emergency arises, the worthy skipper reads through the chapter he believes to bear upon the case in hand and goes to work as best he may. On these occasions the personal factor is a large one. So it is in dealing with psychic trouble. Wide experience is needed for diagnosis, and specially trained faculties and specially developed powers are needed to cope with the conditions that may be found. This book is more in the nature of a manual of first aid than a treatise on treatment. We must also bear in mind that just as the potent drug is effectual in the hands of the expert but dangerous in the hands of the amateur, so do the more potent occult formula need special equipment for their use. Moreover, a formula that is used indiscriminately by the uninitiated is apt to lose its potency and become useless. The popular expletive which G.B.S. introduced into polite society in his play, Pygmalion, is the worn-out remnant of the once powerful adjuration, by Our Lady. Moreover, no 2 cases are alike, and the clear-cut, typical case is a rarity and treasure. Common sense, natural aptitude, and experience are the exorcist's best equipment. Having made his diagnosis and being ready to proceed to the handling of the case, the exorcist has to achieve 3 things. He must repair his patient's aura, clear the atmosphere of his environment, and break his contact with the forces that are causing the trouble. These 3 things are interdependent, and not one of them is first or last. It is next to impossible to get a damaged aura to heal if you do not clear the atmosphere, nor will the atmosphere remain clear for long if you cannot break the contacts. Theoretically, the ideal thing to do is to break the contacts as a start. But unfortunately, in actual practice, these often take a good deal of finding, and a good deal of handling after they have been found. Meanwhile, something has to be done to keep the patient going. The exorcist has got to clear himself a place in which to work. Or if the victim of the attack is defending himself single-handed, he has got to throw up some temporary defenses while he digs himself in. The first thing to do when dealing with an occult attack is to make a temporary clearance of the atmosphere and so gain breathing space in which to reform the shattered ranks. This is more readily achieved by an organized ritual than by unaided willpower. Any act performed with intention becomes a rite. We can take a bath with no more in mind than physical cleanliness, in which case the bath will cleanse our bodies and no more. Or we can take a bath with a view to ritual cleanliness, in which case its efficacy will extend beyond the physical plane. We therefore perform certain physical actions not only as a means of clearing etheric conditions, but also as a means of definitely affecting astral ones through the imagination, a very potent weapon in all magical operations. Physical objects become impregnated with etheric emanations and retain them for considerable periods as a knife will retain a smell of onions and taint everything that is cut with it. These emanations, magnetism as they are called in the terminology of occult science, profoundly affect any sensitive person who is in contact with them. There is something in the old superstition that it is unlucky to place boots on a table. It is equally inadvisable to place outdoor garments on a bed. You do not know whom you have rubbed shoulders with in bus or train, so why give their magnetism a chance to contaminate your sleeping place? Fortunately for all of us, magnetism is a very fugitive force, and although it may be potent when fresh, it soon fades unless it has been deliberately created by means of ritual. The terrible atmosphere that surrounds the victim of an occult attack and permeates all his belongings is not difficult to get rid of, though it will rapidly reform unless the conditions which gave rise to it are cleared up. The most effectual way of getting rid of magnetism is to move to a fresh place, taking nothing of one's old belongings with one. This, however, is a counsel of perfection for most people. Fortunately there are other devices which enable us to attain our ends nearly as effectually. If it be in any way possible, let the victim of an occult attack move temporarily to another environment, taking with him as few of his belongings as possible, and let him make the move in new clothes, or in clothes that are just back from the cleaner. Let him, moreover, keep his whereabouts a secret as far as it is convenient for him to do so. There is an old superstition that a witch can be thrown off the trail by crossing running water. It is my opinion that many of these old folk beliefs have a basis in fact, however overlaid by superstition they may have become. I once had a curious experience which gives support to this opinion. I was about to take part in an important piece of occult work to which I knew there would be opposition. A friend who was concerned in the matter asked me to dine with her on the night before the day fixed for the proceeding. We were both conscious of tension in the atmosphere, and she suggested that I should remain the night at her flat instead of returning to my own, informing no one of my whereabouts in order to throw the attack off the trail. The maneuver was not wholly successful, and we had a rather trying night, and I was conscious of a good deal of psychic tension next day. I decided therefore to walk to the appointed place across Hyde Park in order to refresh myself. When part of the way across, I suddenly felt that the tension relaxed, and I was able to go through the work in hand without interference. I told my friend of this experience, and she questioned me as to where I was when it took place. We looked up the spot on a map, and found that I had just crossed the underground conduit which takes the overflow from the Serpentine. I did not know of the old superstition concerning running water, neither did I know of the existence of the conduit. Nevertheless, the sense of relief was sufficiently marked to cause me to mention it when I saw my friend again, and to be able to indicate the spot where it had occurred. We have very little exact knowledge concerning these subtle forces which are the basis of both occult attack and spiritual healing, but we have good reason to believe that in their nature they are closely analogous to electricity. They are not inanimate forces, however, but have in their nature something that is akin to life, though of a low type. It has been my experience that if we work on a blended analogy of electricity and bacteriology, we get pretty near the facts, as near, at any rate, as our present state of knowledge permits. In other words, if we act as if thought possessed the combined qualities of electricity and bacteria, we shall have a sufficiently accurate method of steering by dead reckoning in the absence of certain knowledge and actual sight. If we consider the various methods used in folk magic of all ages and races, we shall observe that they are in agreement with these hypotheses. Running water, we know, has peculiar electrical qualities, as is witnessed by its effect on the divining rod in the hands of a sensitive person. Whatever it may be that affects the diviner is probably the same thing that affects the occult attack. When we recall, moreover, that running water will throw hounds off the scent just as effectually as it will the alleged witch, we may feel that we cannot be accused of gross superstition if we give the old folk tradition a trial and note the results. Water, again, is the vehicle of purification. It is used in the rite of baptism by the Church and in the preparation of the place by the occultist about to perform a ceremony. Strictly speaking, there should be a trace of salt in the water thus employed, and both salt and water are blessed with powerful invocations when the priest is preparing holy water, whether for a baptism, or for placing in the holy water stoup for the use of the congregation. As far as the occultist is concerned, salt to him is the emblem of the element of earth. It is also a crystalline substance, and crystalline substances, in their different forms, receive and hold etheric magnetism better than anything else. Water, on the other hand, is the emblem of the psychic sphere. These two realms, between them, contain by far the greatest part of occult evil. It is rare indeed that spiritual wickedness in high places will reach up as far as the airy realms of mind or the fiery realms of spirit. If we want to get into touch with, or operate upon a particular sphere, we use as base a substance appropriate thereto. Consequently, a solution of salt and water makes a better base than either salt or water could do separately, because it enables us to cover the whole of the sphere of probable operations in a single act. It may be interesting to note concerning the magical properties of crystalline substances, that crystals are used in wireless apparatus to pick up the subtle vibrations of the ether. Once again we are close upon the trail of our electrobacteriological analogy. It is an excellent plan, when trying to break an undesirable psychic contact, to immerse oneself in a bath of water that has been especially consecrated for the purpose, redressing in new or at least clean clothing afterwards, and if it be by any means possible, moving into a different room. If this cannot be done, move the bed into a different position, taking care to turn it at a different angle, that is to say, if you have been in the habit of sleeping lying north and south, place your bed so that you will now be lying east and west. The following prayers may be used for the blessing of the salt and water. Pointing the first and second fingers at the salt. I exorcise thee, creature of earth, by the living God, plus, by the holy God, plus, by the omnipotent God, plus, that thou mayest be purified of all evil influences in the name of Adonai, who is Lord of angels and of men. Extending hand over her salt. Creature of earth, adore thy Creator. In the name of God the Father Almighty, Maker of heaven and earth, and of Jesus Christ his Son, our Saviour, I consecrate thee, plus, to the service of God, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Pointing first and second fingers at the water. I exorcise thee, creature of water, by the living God, plus, by the holy God, plus, by the omnipotent God, plus, that thou mayest be purified from all evil influences in the name of Elohim Sabaoth, who is Lord of angels and of men. Extending hand over water. Creature of water, adore thy Creator. In the name of God the Father Almighty, who decreed a firmament in the midst of the waters, and of Jesus Christ his Son our Saviour, I consecrate thee, plus, to the service of God, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. Casting the salt into the water. We pray thee, O God, Lord of heaven and earth, and of all that in them is, both visible and invisible, that thou mayest stretch forth the right hand of thy power upon these creatures of the elements and hallow them in thy holy name. Grant that this salt may make for health of body and this water for health of soul, and that there may be banished from the place where they are used every power of adversity and every illusion and artifice of evil, for the sake of Jesus Christ our Saviour. Amen. The water thus consecrated may be used as a bath, or for making the sign of cross upon the forehead, or for sprinkling about a place. When thus using it, the following prayer may be employed. In the name which is above every other name, and in the power of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, I exorcise all influences and seeds of evil, I lay upon them the spell of Christ's holy church, that they may be bound fast as with chains and cast into outer darkness, that they trouble not the servants of God. In pointing or making the sign of the cross, plus, the first and second fingers are extended and the third and fourth are bent towards the palm of the hand and the thumb laid upon their nails. When the hand is extended in blessing over the salt and water, it is held flat, fingers together and parallel, and thumb stretched at right angles to the forefinger. If there is sufficient occult force at work to produce physical phenomena, it is very advisable to take precautions to prevent materializations taking place. The physical phenomena are of several types. They may take the form of noises, usually creakings, thuds, or more rarely bell-like notes or wailing sounds. If actual words are heard, auditory hallucinations should be suspected, for in the absence of a medium, spirit messages are given to the inner ear, not to the auditory nerve. Lights may also be seen, usually taking the form of dim balls of luminous mist drifting like soap bubbles. They may be any size from mere points of light to considerable dimensions, some 6 feet or more in diameter. In these spheres of dim luminosity psychics can generally see forms, sometimes human, sometimes from the animal kingdom. Whitish-gray clouds can also sometimes be seen, rising pillar-wise from the floor like smoke. These are usually fixed to one place and do not move about the room as do the spheres of light, such movement as occurs being within themselves, like the eddyings of smoke caught under a tumbler. More rarely a distinctive odor may be noticed, and still more rarely there may be precipitations of powdery substances or slime. Light objects also may be overturned or thrown about the room. There are certain substances which experience has proved to be effectual in preventing the condensation of etheric energy from taking place. Camphor dissolved in vinegar and placed in saucers about the room will cope effectually with low degrees of force, but for higher potencies nitric acid is the best thing to use, a small quantity being poured into a saucer and exposed to the air. It is best to use it well diluted to prevent accidents, for it is not the strength of the acid in the saucer that is efficacious, but its evaporation into the air, and it will evaporate just as well when diluted as when neat. In what manner it works I have not the slightest idea, but its value is well known among psychic experimenters. The methods of occult attack employed in modern Europe are exclusively mental, so far as my experience of them has gone at any rate. That is to say, they work by the mind on the mind, and only affect physical conditions incidentally. In the East and among primitive people, however, other aspects have to be considered, as a much more etheric type of magic is in use under primitive conditions of life and upon virgin soils. For these etheric operations, material substances are required in order that the magnetism attached to them may be made use of. Hair combings, nail parings, cast-off clothes, objects in familiar use, all contain magnetism. Consequently, care should be taken to see that such things are effectually disposed of when discarded. Combings and nail parings should be promptly burnt. Cast-off clothing should never be allowed to go out of the possession of the owner till it has had at least 3 days exposure to sun and air in the open. The magnetism will be more effectually dispelled if the garments be laid on the earth, especially freshly turned earth, than if hung on a line. The same applies to furniture. The chair that has been the accustomed seat and, above all things, the bedding, should be thoroughly aired and sunned before they are parted with. The same precautions are useful if any second-hand article has been purchased. The disposal of night soil should also be carefully arranged for and entrusted to reliable servants, abundant disinfectants and deodorants being constantly in use. Precautions should be observed to prevent any native obtaining access to fresh excreta. After the animal heat has gone out of it, its magical value has greatly decreased. A dirty handkerchief, too, is an effectual magnetic link, and so are dressings from a wound. Anything, in fact, that bears traces of any of the byproducts of the body. But apart from any question of psychic attack, there are 2 substances which are especially prized for purposes of magic, and these are seminal fluid and menstrual blood. The former is used in fertility rites and the latter in certain forms of evocation. These substances are exceedingly hard to come by in primitive lands, because the natives, knowing their significance, guard them most scrupulously, but the Sahib has no suspicions, and allows stained garments and bed linen to go into the hands of the washerman to be disposed of at his discretion, satisfied so long as the garments themselves return safely at the end of the week, and never thinking to inquire what becomes of the water in which they were washed. There are many parts of the world in which the sale of these magical substances is a profitable sideline of the laundering business. In Europe, menstrual blood and feces are part of the magical substances of the black mass, being made up into patens with wheat flour. A time-honored method of clearing a bad psychic atmosphere out of a house, and one which I have known in my own experience to be effectual, is to strew garlic about the place, leave it overnight and then take it up and burn it. Among country people, an onion is sometimes placed in a vase on the mantelpiece as if it were a hyacinth bulb when unpleasant visitors are expected, and solemnly burned in the kitchen fire as soon as they have departed, it being believed that the onion tribe have the property of absorbing noxious emanations. It is curious to note in this respect that in one coal mine to my knowledge the miners are forbidden to take onions down into the workings as part of their dinners because the onions absorb the underground gases and become poisonous. My informant told me that he and others had smuggled onions down and learnt from bitter experience the wisdom of this rule. Methods of Defense, Part 2. There are 2 types of practical psychic work which may be used separately or in combination, the latter method, in my opinion, giving by far the best results, though the exponents of each are apt to decry the other. The method which we will distinguish as the meditative method consists of mediation upon abstract qualities, such as peace, harmony, protection, and the love of God. It is the method of the New Thought school, and its value lies in the harmonizing effect it has upon the emotional state and its counteracting of harmful autosuggestions. The other method, which we will call the invocative, consists in the invocation of external potencies and the employment of formal methods for the focusing of their force. This method has many gradations of complexity and an infinite variety of technique. It ranges from the simplest prayer which calls upon Christ with the sign of the cross, to the most elaborate rituals of exorcism performed with bell, book, and candle. The essence of the system lies in the attempt to dissect out from the general force of good the particular aspect of energy that is needed, and the use of some symbol to act as the magical vehicle of that force upon the plane of form. This symbol may be a mental picture of the blue robe of Our Lady, it may be the action of making the sign of the cross, it may be the consecrated water sprinkled for token of cleansing, or it may be some object specially magnetized to act as a talisman. In the invocative method the aim is to concentrate the force, and therefore some symbol of form has to be employed. In the meditative method the aim is to escape beyond the bounds of form into the atmosphere of pure spirit, too exalted for evil to enter, and therefore the use of any form or formula is eschewed as calculated to prevent the soul from rising into this pure air. In my opinion, and with all due respect to the practitioners of this latter method, much better results would be obtained if the invocative method, with its utilization of the efficacy of formula, were used to enable the mind to climb into the pure air of spiritual consciousness where no evil is. It is only those who are highly trained in meditation who can rise on the planes unaided. It is exceedingly difficult to take off from sense consciousness without the use of some kind of psychological device to act as a springboard. There seems to be little object in refusing for purely academic reasons to avail ourselves of a method of proven efficacy. If we realize that the use of forms and symbols is merely a psychological device to enable the mind to get a grip on the intangible, we shall not fall into the error of superstitious observances. A superstition has been defined as the blind use of a form whose significance has been forgotten. On the other hand, we shall be unwise to rely exclusively upon formal or ceremonial methods unless at the same time we use meditative methods in order to purify and harmonize our own consciousness. If we neglect this aspect of our work, we shall reinfect by our own vibrations the magic circle as fast as we have cleared it. It is not much use sealing a circle with the protective names if we allow a panic-stricken imagination to run riot, picturing every conceivable kind of evil and leaving blank spaces for the possibility of inconceivable kinds. Equally, however, we shall find it very much easier to perform the harmonizing meditation if we are working within the protection of a magic circle. To attempt to perform the work of exorcism solely by means of meditation is like raising a weight by the unaided effort of our two hands. The employment of the magical method resembles the use of a lever, or a pulley and block. Our muscles are still the sole source of energy, but by the utilization of mechanical principles we have redoubled their power. Let us, then, in meditation, use symbols to concentrate our attention. We shall find this much easier than meditation in terms of abstract thought. Indeed, in times of stress and crisis, abstract thought may be impossible for us unless we are very experienced in its use, but we shall seldom reach a state when we cannot picture the cross and call upon the name of Christ. Occult attacks may be divided into two types, those which take place by means of thought forms, and those which operate by means of a current of force. But even in the latter case the current of force soon gathers to itself or germinates thought forms congenial to its nature. Therefore in every psychic disturbance the thought form is a factor which has to be considered and dealt with, and which, in fact, forms the readiest means of diagnosis, for it is by the perception of the associated thought forms that the experienced psychic is able to detect the nature of the attack. Thought force is a thing which has no relation to geographical position, but is a matter of pure consciousness and of tuning into its keynote. We can pick up the forces of dead faiths 1,000 years after the death of their last votary, and upon the opposite side of the globe to that in which they flourished. But thought forms are a different matter. They have position in space, and although they can be moved about with the speed of thought, and can be withdrawn to the subtlest level of the astral and there anchored to an idea and thus prevented from impinging upon the planes of form for all practical purposes, nevertheless, although they do not occupy space, they can be referred to definite positions in space. They can, for instance, be associated with a particular object, and will follow that object about, remaining within its magnetic field. The immediate magnetic field is anything from 12 to 30 feet, the remote magnetic field from 100 to 300 yards. Powerful holy centers, like Glastonbury or Lourdes, have a bigger magnetic field than this, extending possibly to a couple of miles. They are also interconnected among themselves by lines of force. These things have to be taken into account in practical occult work. When we are confronted by a disturbing influence emanating from a focus of power, such as the site of an old temple, we have got to deal with the remote magnetic field by means of ceremonial. As this is a method that can only be used by a high-grade initiate, we will not consider it here. For all practical purposes in a psychic attack, it is the immediate magnetic field that has to be considered. The best method to deal with this is to make a magic circle. A mere banishing by itself is not so effective as a banishing performed within a circle, because the circle will effectually prevent the banished forces from flowing back again. There are various methods of performing this operation, but the principle of all valid ones is the same. The more potent conjurations cannot be given in these pages, because their effective use depends upon the grade of initiation possessed by the person who proposes to use them, and to possess a formula without the grade to which it belongs is as unsatisfactory as possessing a gun without any knowledge of shooting. The formula I will give will be found effectual for all ordinary conditions. Extraordinary conditions can only be dealt with by a person who has had experience. In making the magic circle, the operator stands upright facing east. He faces east because the magnetic current on which he proposes to operate runs from east to west. His first procedure must be to steady his own vibrations and purify his aura. In order to do this, he makes the Kabbalistic cross on breast and brow. Touching his forehead he says, "To thee, O God," touching his solar plexus, "be the kingdom," touching his right shoulder, "and the power," touching his left shoulder, "and the glory," clasping his hands, "unto the ages of the ages. Amen." By this formula the operator affirms the power of God as sole creator and supreme law of the universe to which all things must bow, and he establishes this formula magnetically in his aura by the action of making the sign of the cross upon himself. This sign is not an exclusively Christian symbol, and can be used as readily by the Jew as the churchman, for it is the equilimbed cross of nature that is being used, not the Calvary cross, of which the shaft is double the length of the crossbar, and which is the symbol of sacrifice. The equilimbed cross refers to the 4 quarters of the globe and the 4 elements, and the formula associated with it proclaims the dominion of God over these, and thereby occultly formulates his kingdom within the sphere of the operator. The operator next imagines himself to be clasping in his right hand a large, cross-handled sword, such as is depicted in pictures of crusaders. He holds it point upright and says, "In the name of God I take in hand the sword of power for defense against evil and aggression," and imagines himself to be towering up to twice his natural height, a tremendous armed and mailed figure, vibrating with the force of the power of God with which he has been charged by his formulation of the sword of power. He now proceeds to draw the magic circle upon the floor with the point of the sword of power, and he should see in his imagination a line of flame following the point of the sword, consisting of small flames, such as spring up when methylated spirit is spilt and ignited, but of a pale golden color. A little practice should enable this circle of light to be formulated effectually. Keep on going round the circle until it is formulated. The circle should always be drawn diocese, that is to say, from east, to south, to west, to north, in the same way that the hands of a clock would move were the clock laid face upwards on the floor. The contrary way is Widdershins, the way in which the witches danced at the Sabbats. The diocese movement affirms the rule of God's law in nature because it is the way of the sun. The Widdershins movement repudiates God's rule over nature by moving against the sun. In resisting an occult attack, the whole formula should be tuned to the keynote of asserting God's dominion over all existence, the aim of the operator being to align himself with cosmic law and cause the power of God to deal with the interference. The circle being formulated, the operator, ceasing to visualize the sword but still visualizing the circle, clasps his hands in prayer, and raising them above his head towards the east, prays, "May the mighty Archangel Raphael protect me from all evil approaching from the east." Turning to the south he repeats the same formula in prayer to Gabriel. Turning to the west, he invokes Michael. Turning to the north he invokes Uriel. Facing to the east again, and thus completing the circle, he repeats the formula of the Kabbalistic cross. This formulation of the magic circle is especially valuable for protecting the sleeping place, the circle being drawn around the bed. It is not necessary to move about the room, or shift the furniture in order to draw the circle, it will be formulated wherever it is visualized to be. It is necessary to reaffirm this circle each time the tides change, that is to say, a circle made after sundown will hold good till sunrise, and a circle made after sunrise will maintain its potency till sunset. After the circle has been affirmed a number of times in the same place, its influence will persist for a considerable period, but it is advisable to reformulate it morning and evening during the active phase of an attack. Incense burnt within the circle is very helpful, but care has to be exercised in the choice of an incense. Joss sticks of unknown composition should never be used, as they are usually compounded with a view to assisting manifestation. Good quality church incense, such as can be bought at most church furnishers, is safe and satisfactory because it is compounded according to traditional recipes. Cheaper qualities may not fulfill these conditions. In dealing with elementals or non-human entities, the pentagram, or pentalapha, is the best weapon. This is a 5-pointed star drawn in a particular way. Pointing the first and second fingers of the right hand, and folding the others into the palm and touching their tips with the thumb, proceed to draw the pentagram in the air, keeping the elbow stiff and swinging the arm at full length. Start with the right arm across the body, the hand about the level of the left hip, the extended fingers pointing downwards and outwards. Swing it upwards, as if drawing a straight line in the air, until the fingers point straight upwards above the head at arm's length. Now sweep it down again, keeping the elbow stiff, until the hand occupies the corresponding position upon the right side to that from which it started on the left. You have now drawn a gigantic V upside down. Next swing the hand across the body, on a rising incline, until it is stretched on a level with the left shoulder, pointing to the left. Bring it across the body horizontally until it is in the same position on the right, fingers pointing away from the body. Now swing it downwards across the body till the hand has come back to the point by the left hip whence it started. This is an exceedingly potent sign. The value of the 5-pointed star, the symbol of humanity, is widely known among occultists, but its potency depends upon the manner in which it is drawn. The method I have given is the correct one for banishing. The potency of the sign may be illustrated by an experience of my own in using it, which the skeptical are at liberty to doubt if they wish. I merely mention it for the sake of those who may be interested. I was taking part in some work with an Indian occultist when I became suspicious that all was not as it should be, protested, and was asked to withdraw. I did so, determined to watch proceedings from a distance, and if my suspicions were confirmed, to have an expose. A few days later I was sitting in my room one afternoon chatting with a friend. It was just getting dusk, and we were talking by the light of a gas fire. Suddenly we were both aware simultaneously of a presence in the room and turned spontaneously in the same direction. My friend sensed an antagonistic presence, and I, being more psychic, saw who it was, and had no difficulty in perceiving the form of my Indian associate in an egg-shaped sphere of misty yellow light. I told my friend to quit the room and wait in the hall, and as soon as the door closed behind her, I made use of the pentagram I have described, together with certain names of power that are unsuitable for disclosure in these pages. Immediately the appearance in the corner by the door shattered and vanished. At the same time there was a resounding crack, which my friend heard in the hall. I called to her to return, and as she entered she exclaimed, "Look what has happened to the door," and we found that one of the panels had split clean in two. It was this that had evidently caused the loud crack we had both heard. I offer no explanation of this incident for the good and sufficient reason that I do not know what the explanation may be. I merely state what happened. My readers can explain it as they please. When it is not possible to seal the room, it is a very useful thing to be able to seal the aura. Stand upright and cross yourself, by touching forehead, breast, right shoulder, and left shoulder, saying, "By the power of the Christ of God within me, whom I serve with all my heart and with all my soul and with all my strength, extend your hands forward as far as you can reach at the level of the solar plexus, fingertips touching, then sweep them round to the back and touch the fingertips together again behind you, saying, I encompass myself about with the divine circle of his protection, across which no mortal error dares to set its foot. This is an old monkish formula. It is very effectual, but its potency only lasts about 4 hours. There are various other devices which are useful, not only in dealing with psychic attacks, but in any case of undue influence or domination. If you have to interview persons whose influence you find overwhelming, imagine that they are separated from you by a sheet of plate glass. You can see them, and hear them, but their magnetism cannot reach you. Visualize this sheet of glass until it appears to you to be absolutely tangible. If you have to associate with persons who distress you, but are not actually interviewing them, imagine that they are separated from you by a brick wall, and say to yourself, you just aren't there. I can't see you or hear you, and you simply don't exist. When dealing with a person who saps your vitality, interlace your fingers, and lay your folded hands upon your solar plexus, keeping your elbows pressed against your sides. Keep your feet touching each other. You have thus contacted all your own terminals and made of your body a closed circuit. No magnetism will go out from you while you maintain this attitude. Your friend will probably complain of your lack of sympathy, however kindly you may speak. If anyone tries to dominate you by gazing intently into the eyes, do not attempt to return gaze for gaze, for this only leads to an exhausting struggle in which you may get the worst of it, but look steadily at the spot just above the base of their nose, between the inner ends of the eyebrows. If you are merely dealing with an ordinary bully, you will immediately have the upper hand. If, however, your antagonist has knowledge of mind power, you may not be able to dominate him, but he certainly will not be able to dominate you, and the result will be a stalemate. Do not attempt to dominate him, merely keep your eye on the spot and wait for him to weary of his attempt to dominate you. You will not have long to wait. By the use of the methods described in the preceding pages, any person of normal courage and mentality, provided he avoids drugs, alcohol, and long periods without food, can, if he does not lose his nerve, wear down any ordinary psychic attack, or in the case of attacks of abnormal potency, can at least ensure himself time to make good his escape and seek help. The sacraments are also a most potent source of spiritual power, and a church where the Blessed Sacrament is reserved, or which is sufficiently old to have been consecrated before the Reformation, is an effectual sanctuary. Methods of Defense Part 2. Psychic trouble not infrequently arises owing to the formation of an undesirable rapport. In order to understand the nature of this problem, we must consider the whole subject of rapport. We have already considered in some detail the question of telepathic suggestion. Rapport might be considered as the passive aspect of that of which telepathic suggestion is the active aspect. It forms, in fact, the basic condition necessary for telepathic suggestion to take place. Two people who are in rapport might be described as astral Siamese twins. Although the physical bodies are independent units, the astral bodies are linked in such a manner that there is free circulation of astral force between them, just as the circulatory system of the mother is connected through the umbilical cord with the unborn child, and the same blood circulating freely through both. This fact explains many important occult phenomena. It is the real key to marriage, and explains many facts in the relationship of parent and child. It also accounts for some important aspects of the relation of pupil and teacher. But not only is it possible for a rapport to be established between two individuals, but between an individual and a group. This fact plays an important part in all fraternity work. It is also possible to establish rapport between a human being and other kingdoms of nature, with discarnate entities, superhuman beings, and, in fact, with any form of life with which an individual can form a sympathetic understanding. There must be some ground of sympathy as the basis for the formation of a rapport, but once formed, it can be developed almost indefinitely. It is a curious fact that if a rapport is long continued, the persons thus united gradually come to resemble each other. We all know the horsey type of man, also the son of the soil, of whom it was expressively remarked, Father's in the pigsty. You'll know him by his hat. When two human beings are in rapport, the less positive of the two tends to lose his own individuality and becomes the pale reflection of the other. It is for this reason that the Western occultist, who values individuality highly, does not take personal pupils in the same way as does the Eastern guru, but prefers to work through ritual with a group because this method is more impersonal. But even so, the individual members of a group will undergo certain changes whereby they are tuned into the group tone, so that there will be a certain common denominator which they all possess. Who cannot recognize the sign manual of the Christian Scientist, the Theosophist, the Quaker? Any system which has group meditation rapidly puts its mark on its members. In this fact, of course, lies much of the value of association with a worthy group. In it, equally, lies the detriment of association with an unworthy group. Let us consider what happens when a person of ordinary good character becomes associated with a group of degenerate moral tone. He will either find himself in such sharp antagonism to the group mind that he will have no option but to withdraw, or he will rapidly but unconsciously be tuned to the keynote of his new associates. Without his being aware of the fact, his moral sense will have become blunted and he will accept as a matter of course what he would originally have turned from in disgust. Rapport once established, other things beside the general feeling tone can be shared. Actual ideas can be transferred from one mind to another as in telepathy, and in the same way, vital force can be transmitted. It is this fact which is the explanation of certain types of spiritual healing. When etheric vitality is being transmitted, it is necessary that the persons concerned should be within the immediate magnetic field of each other, but when astral force is in question, this is not necessary. Transmission is independent of space. We are not now considering the legitimate use of this force for healing, or for teaching and developing neophytes, so we will not, therefore, consider its modus operandi in detail. Enough has been said to show in what way it works. Let us now proceed to the consideration of the practical methods of breaking such a rapport if for any reason it is desired to discontinue its use. To astral vision the telepathic link appears as a ray of light, a shining cord, or some similar thought form, because it is in this form that it is usually formulated by the person who is making the magnetic link. It sometimes happens, however, if the operator has a high grade of initiation, that instead of connecting the ray direct to the person with whom he desires to be in touch, he will formulate an astral animal at the end of it to which he transfers a modicum of his own consciousness. This animal form is called a watcher. It does not act on its own initiative unless attacked, when it defends itself according to the nature of the species in whose likeness it is made. The use of a watcher is to obtain a record of what is transpiring without the necessity of focusing consciousness thereon. When the psychic substance of the watcher is reabsorbed by the adept, he becomes aware of the content of the watcher's consciousness. The disadvantage of this method lies in the vulnerableness of the watcher to psychic attack, and the fact that its projector is affected if it is injured or disintegrated. In dealing with a thought form, always bear in mind that it is the product of the imagination, and is in no sense self-existent. What the imagination has made, the imagination can unmake. If the maker of a thought form has thought it into existence by picturing it imaginatively, you can equally well think it out of existence by picturing it clearly and imagining it bursting into 1,000 fragments, or going up in flames, or dissolving into water and being absorbed by the soil. That which is thought into existence by the imagination can be thought out of existence by the imagination. If what was taken for a thought form resists destruction by this method, it is probably an artificial elemental. Now there are two such elementals, one kind being ensouled by the invocation of elemental essence into a thought form, and the other by the projection of something of the magician's own nature into it. If it is ensouled by elemental essence, the use of the pentagram will serve to banish it, but if it is of the kind that is ensouled by the magician's own force, another method must be used, known as absorption. Now absorption is a very high-grade method, and its successful use depends upon the state of consciousness of the user. Each individual has to decide for himself whether in any given case at a given moment he is in a fit state to attempt it. Unless he can completely steady his own vibrations and arrive at a state of perfect serenity and freedom from all sense of effort, he should not make the attempt. We will, however, describe the method for the benefit of those who care to try it. Harmonizing himself by mediation upon the Christ, the adept, as soon as he is satisfied that his own vibrations are steady, proceeds to call up before his astral vision the image of the form he intends to destroy. He sees it clearly in all its details and seeks to divine its nature, whether it is a vehicle for malice or lust, or vampiric action. These are the three most common, and it can almost certainly be assigned to one or other of these classes. Having discerned the type of the force with which he has to deal, he then proceeds to meditate upon its opposite, concentrating upon purity and selflessness if the force be lust, compassion and love, if it be malice, and upon God as the creator and sustainer of all life if it be vampiric. He continues this meditation until he feels himself suffused with the quality upon which he is meditating, until he feels himself so imbued with purity and selflessness that lust causes him to feel nothing but pity, malice causes him to feel nothing but compassion, and in regard to vampirism, he is so assured that his life is hid with Christ in God that he would willingly let the vampire finish its meal in peace if he could thereby help it. In fact, the adept who proposes to perform a magical absorption has to reach the point where he has clearly realized the nothingness of the evil he proposes to absorb, and no longer has any feeling towards it but pity for an ignorance that thinks it can gain any good thing for itself in this way. He desires to uplift and educate and free the misguided soul from its bondage. Until he has arrived at the point when he has no other feeling than this towards his persecutor, it is not safe for him to attempt an absorption. Having satisfied himself that he is ready for the attempt, he proceeds to draw the thought form towards him by pulling in the silver cord that connects it with his solar plexus if it be a vampiric thought form, or by opening his aura to it and enfolding it if it be one of the other two types. He literally sucks it in. This process should be done slowly and gradually, taking some minutes in the doing. If it be done suddenly, the adept may not find it possible to keep his own vibrations steady, and then he will indeed be in an unpleasant situation. As the thought form is absorbed, the adept will feel a reaction in his own nature corresponding to the type of the thought form. If it is a lust force, he will feel desire rise within him; if it is a malicious force, he will feel anger, and if it is a vampire, he will feel bloodlust. He must immediately overcome this feeling and revert to his mediation upon the opposite quality, maintaining it until his vibrations are once more fully harmonized. He will then know that the evil force has been neutralized and there is that much less evil in the world. He will immediately feel a great access of vigor and a sense of spiritual power, as if he could say to a mountain, "Be ye cast into the sea," and it would be done. It is this sense of spiritual exaltation and power which tells him that the work has been successfully accomplished. It is, however, advisable to repeat the meditation at intervals for 2 or 3 days in case another thought form is formulated and sent after the first. As for the sender of the thought form, when the absorption takes place he will feel that virtue has gone out of him, and may even be reduced temporarily to a state of semi-collapse. He will soon revive, however, but with his power for evil of this particular type considerably reduced for some time to come, and if he have the possibility of reform in his nature, it may even be that he himself will be permanently freed from this type of evil. The great advantage of this method is that it actually destroys the evil, root and branch, whereas the mere destruction of a thought form is like cutting off the top of a weed. On the other hand, it can only be done by an advanced occultist keyed up to the highest pitch. If one is disturbed or harassed or has in any degree lost his nerve, one dare not attempt it. If the rapport is perceived as a line of light, a cord, or any similar form, attached to the solar plexus, the forehead, or any other part of the body, the best way of severing the rapport is to forge a magical weapon and cut it. In fact, if a rapport is felt, the first thing to do is to visualize the cord and try to see where it attaches. The solar plexus is the commonest place. Next, formulate the cross-handled sword as already described, and invoke God's blessing upon it. Then visualize a flaming torch, and invoke the power of the Holy Ghost, whose symbol it is. Now with the sword hack through the cord or ray until every shred is severed. Then sear the stump with the consecrated fire of the torch until it shrivels up and falls off from its point of attachment to your body. After such a severing one must, of course, take the ordinary human precautions to prevent the link being reformed. Refuse to meet the person responsible for its formulation, or to either read or answer letters from him. In fact, cut off physical communications as thoroughly and resolutely as one has cut off astral ones for a period of some months at least. There are occasions, however, when a person is so completely overshadowed and dominated that he cannot perform this operation for himself. The magical operation of substitution can then be performed, if he can find a friend ready to undertake the task. In order to perform this operation, the two friends agree that it shall be done, but the one who is to become the substitute does not tell the original victim when he proposes to undertake the operation, lest that latter should be so completely in the hands of the dominator that he should give the game away involuntarily. Choosing a time at which he is sure his friend is asleep, the substitute concentrates upon him and imagines himself to be standing beside him, and visualizes the cord or ray of the rapport stretching from his friend out into space. If he can visualize its other point of attachment in the dominator, so much the better. He then formulates the sword and the torch as above described, and with these in his hands he imagines himself stepping right through the line of rapport, so as to break it with his body. He must not use either sword or torch for this process, but break it with his own flesh, as it were. Having thus severed it from his friend, he should then go for it with sword and torch with all his strength as it tries to enwrap him, as it assuredly will do, for it resembles nothing so much as the tentacle of an octopus. He should go for it hammer and tongs, making up in zeal what he lacks in knowledge, until it has had enough, and begins to curl up and withdraw. The combat, of course, takes place in the imagination, but if a clear and vivid image is produced it will be effectual. In illustration of this method I may mention a case I once handled by its means. I was asked if I could help a woman who had been a lifelong invalid, but whose case the many doctors she had consulted were neither able to diagnose satisfactorily, nor to help. They all agreed that there was nothing organic the matter with her, and after trying in vain to get her better, they generally united in saying that it was pure hysteria. She suffered from a chronic condition of exhaustion, indigestion, attacks of vomiting, blinding headache and palpitation of the heart. She was, however, not in the least of a neurotic disposition, but a quiet, sensible, intellectual woman, bearing her sufferings with fortitude. I made a psychic diagnosis and came to the following conclusion: that for many past lives she had been upon the path, and that in her last life, a male incarnation, in order to speed up her progress she had travelled in the East, and eventually took initiation into one of the Tibetan orders, which unfortunately turned out to be upon the left-hand path. Here she learnt the Hatha Yoga, which gives control over the functions of the body. In her present life, she retained the powers her training had given her, but not the memory of its technique. Consequently her emotional states affected those automatic systems of nervous control whose functions are normally not under the direction of the mind. Whenever, therefore, she was emotionally disturbed, her subconscious mentation overflowed into the automatic mind and threw certain of the functional systems of the body out of gear. It is my belief that this explanation affords a key to a good many cases of functional disorder. Many people in the course of occult meditative practices obtain control of the automatic mind which controls the functioning of the bodily organs. It may be recalled that the famous scientist, Sir Francis Galton, the founder of the science of eugenics, experimented with mental control of respiration, and having obtained it, found that the automatic function had fallen into abeyance, and he had to spend 3 anxious days breathing by willpower and voluntary attention until the automatic function was re-established. In this particular case, however, there was more than disturbance of function, there was this peculiar and very marked chronic exhaustion. I formed the opinion that a rapport still existed between her and the Tibetan order of which she had been an initiate in her previous life. As is well known to occultists, one returns life after life to the order of which one is an initiate, the rapport being a very strong one. This is one of the reasons why the great mystery schools have no need to make themselves known by advertising. They know their own, and pick them up on the astral plane. But while it is an invaluable thing to be under the aegis of a reputable order, it is an exceedingly unpleasant thing to stand in a similar relationship to a disreputable order. In this particular case it was my opinion that the order to which this lady had belonged in her previous life had sunk to a very low ebb indeed, and its leaders were deliberately drawing upon the vitality of its members. Acting upon this hypothesis, I projected myself astrally in the way I have already described, and visited this lady at night. I perceived that from her solar plexus as she lay asleep there stretched a black, elastic, stringy-looking substance that resembled nothing so much as a stick of Spanish licorice that has been well chewed by a small boy. This went off into space. Upon trying to see its further end I had a brief and far-off vision of a monastery with a Chinese type of roof perched on a crag among vast mountains. I tackled the situation by the simple expedient of passing in my astral body athwart the line of black substance, thus breaking it. It immediately transferred itself to my solar plexus, and for a moment I felt a surge of tempting thoughts urging me to get this woman under my thumb and exploit her to her full financial capacity. I cast these out, and went for the rope of astral licorice in the manner I have described, casting it off and searing the stump, and had the satisfaction of seeing it curl up and disappear into the darkness. I then fell into what I considered a well-earned sleep. I had told this lady nothing of my ideas because I wanted to see whether I could clear up the case by working solely on the occult hypothesis without any admixture of suggestion. Next morning I visited her to see how she was getting on, and found her sitting up in bed eating a hearty breakfast and looking an entirely different woman to the grey-faced, exhausted creature I had seen the day before. Without waiting for any inquiry from me, she said, "I don't know what has been done, but I feel as if something has been broken and I am free." After breakfast she got up, went for a stroll, and met the doctor who was attending her in the street. So great was the change in her appearance that he failed to recognize her until she spoke to him. I told her that in my opinion she ought to have nothing whatever to do with occult studies lest she reform the magnetic link with her old order, and also taught her how to prevent her subconscious mind from giving disruptive suggestions to her bodily systems of functional control. For some years she remained in good health, but later, unfortunately, took up the study of occultism again and relapsed into a condition approximating to her previous one, having presumably reforged the contacts with the Tibetan Brotherhood which had proved so disastrous to her. Methods of Defense Part 4. There are so many stories of the appearance of guardian angels at moments of crisis that even the most skeptical must admit that there is a case to be answered. There is a tradition in Devon that if Drake's drum, which is preserved at Buckland Abbey near Tavistock, is beaten in a time of crisis, Drake himself will return to lead the fleets of England. Newbold has immortalized this legend in his famous poem. Take my drum to Devon, hang E.T. by the shore. Beat E.T. when your powder's runnin' low. If the Dons sight Devon, I'll quit the port of heaven, and drum them up the channel as we drummed them long ago. The idea of the hero who returns to lead his people, the guardian angel that appears in times of crisis, is sealed deep in the hearts of all nations, and nothing will eradicate it. Innumerable instances were reported by the men returning from the trenches during the war. Let us again refer to the ancient wisdom of the Kabbalah, that storehouse of occult knowledge. We learn here of the good angel and the evil angel of the soul of man who stand behind his right and left shoulder, the one tempting him, and the other inspiring him. Translate the dark angel into terms of modern thought and we have the Freudian subconsciousness. But the Freudians fail to realize that there is also a bright angel who stands behind the right shoulder of every man. This is the mystic superconsciousness or, in other words, the higher self, the holy guardian angel whom Obermelin sought with such ardor and effort. We all know that, when caught off our guard, there comes a dark temptation from the depths of our lower selves, something atavistic stirs, and we think thoughts, or even do deeds, of which we would never have believed ourselves capable. We have heard the voice of the dark angel speaking. Equally in times of dire stress, when we have our backs to the wall and we are fighting for more than our physical lives, another voice makes itself heard, the voice of the bright angel. I have never known this to occur when a man was fighting simply for his physical life. To those who see beyond the veil, death is no great evil, but in times of spiritual crisis, when the very self is being swept away, then it is that the cry of the soul is heard, and something manifests out of the mists of the unseen, manifests in a form that is comprehensible to the one who calls. Whether intense stress induces a temporary expansion of consciousness, a fugitive psychism, or whether a being of its own volition passes through the veil and manifests, I do not know. There are never any details available of these incidents. They take place only in times of dire stress and go as swiftly as they came, leaving no trace except upon the soul. I maintain that even as the lower self can rise up in moments of temptation, so can the higher self descend in moments of spiritual crisis. It is the aim of the mystic to live exclusively in the higher self. It is the aim of the occultist to bring this higher self through into manifestation in brain consciousness. In my flesh shall I see God. Just as surely as the lower self can rise up and betray us to some horrible deed, so can the higher self come to the rescue, terrible as an army with banners. I have already told of the mysterious voice which instructed me how to extricate myself from grave psychic danger. Upon other occasions of stress and strain I have experienced a sudden expansion or shifting of the level of consciousness. The higher self has descended and taken control. From being in the midst of turmoil one is suddenly raised high above it and sees all the circumstances of one's life spread out like a bird's eye view, as one might see the land from a high place, and one knows intuitively the outcome of the matter. All emotional turmoil ceases, and one is like a ship hove to, securely riding out the storm. When this occurs to me, the memory of my past incarnations is always vividly present also. It is this simultaneous wakening of the past which makes me feel that the voice is that of my own higher self, and not of another entity. It is my belief that in times of spiritual crisis the man that has faith in the law of God can rise up and invoke its protection, and a seeming miracle will be performed for his benefit. Yet there can be no breach of natural law, therefore such a miracle must simply be an example of the working of a law with which we are as yet unfamiliar, just as an eclipse appears to the savage as a miracle, but to the astronomer as a natural phenomenon which he can forecast with accuracy. What is it that induces this change of control in our lives? We are familiar with the fact that the engine of a car has 3 speeds and a reverse. May it not be that our minds are also geared, and that it is a changing of gears which induces psychism? Are there not times when we get into reverse and the ape and tiger within us take charge? Behind the physical plane lies the astral plane, and behind the astral plane lies the mental plane, and behind the mental plane lies the spiritual plane, each plane acting as plane of causation to the one beneath it, and each in turn being controlled from the subtler plane above it. When we change gear, consciousness is shifted from a denser to a subtler plane, and we begin to move among remoter and remoter causes, of which the happenings upon the physical plane are the end results. We manipulate these causes and the results are immediately affected. When we change gear from the physical to the astral, we find ourselves upon the plane of psychic consciousness and the lesser magic. Supposing a psychic combat is taking place between 2 occultists, if one of them is of such a grade that he can change gear again, so that consciousness is lifted from the astral to the mental plane, he will be in the sphere of the greater magic and be in full control of the situation. The other can make no stand against him. But what happens in the case of the rare and mystic soul who can shift consciousness once again and engage the gears of a purely spiritual power? He has outclassed the adept. There are many souls who have this mystical spiritual consciousness although they have no occult knowledge. Between the higher and the lower modes of thought there is a great gulf fixed across which they leap precariously. If in a time of crisis they are able to rise up in faith and enter into this mystical consciousness and be still, they will have the upper air of any occultist who relies upon nothing save the technique of occultism. The question of mystical consciousness is, however, outside the scope of our present inquiry, which is concerned with psychic methods and the traditional technique of the occultist. Different temperaments will employ different methods, and the mystical method does not appeal to everybody. The occultist does not ignore the Christ force, however. He recognizes it as among the hierarchy of supreme forces of the universe, although he may not be prepared to assign to it the exclusive position which it occupies in the heart of the Christian mystic. In the Western tradition it is symbolized by Tifereth, the central sephira of the 10 holy sephiroth of the Kabbalistic tree of life. The Christ force is the equilibrating, compensating, healing, redeeming, purifying factor of the universe. It should be invoked in every operation of psychic self-defense where any human element, incarnate or discarnate, is concerned. Where non-human elements, such as elementals, thought forms, or the Qliputh, have to be dealt with, it is the power of God the Father, as creator of the universe, that is invoked, his supremacy over all the kingdoms of nature, visible and invisible, being affirmed. God the Holy Ghost is the force that is employed in initiations, and it should not be invoked during times of psychic difficulty, as its influence will tend to intensify the condition and render the veil yet thinner. There is a very curious aspect of the occult field concerning which something must be said in the present pages, though not a great deal can be revealed, and, to be frank, I do not know a great deal about it myself, but only such aspects as I have actually come across. I have always heard it called the occult police, others may know it by different names, but I believe it to be a very real and concrete thing, though its organization is not upon the physical plane, nor, so far as I know, are its mundane activities gathered up into any single pair of hands. I have crossed its trail upon a number of occasions, and played my part in its activities, and I have talked with others who have also been concerned in it, and they have always said as I do, that it is the inner voice and circumstances alone that direct our activities when we cooperate with this mysterious organization. I think myself that it is organized in national units, for people seem to go in and out of jurisdictions, or to be passed on from one to another. In my experience it has no particular political bias, but concerns itself solely with occult methods applied to criminal ends and offenses against society. One or two illustrative cases may help to make the matter clear. Some complications arose at one time over an Indian occultist who was visiting this country in order to found a school. He was deeply involved in the politics of his own country, and there could be no doubt about it that he disliked the English in all their ways very much indeed. I think that I was the only pure-blooded Anglo-Saxon who was in touch with him. As far as I know, he did not concern himself with mundane plain political activities, his idea being to organize a meditation group which should pour the regenerative spiritual force of the East into the group soul of the British Empire, which he declared was in a very bad way indeed. I maintained, however, that the group soul was not dying, as he held, but very tired, for it was immediately after the war. Moreover, I could not see how anybody who disliked it so very much was going to be able to regenerate it. Nor was I sure that the regeneration was going to be to our taste if we were to get it. This man, whom I will call X, was of an intense spiritual pride, and his root idea was that England must acknowledge the spiritual supremacy of India and take her spiritual inspiration from the East. I was young and inexperienced at the time, but I began to ask myself what manner of spiritual force was going to be poured in through the channel we were constructing. Supposing during the war a group of English occultists had tried to perform a similar service for Germany, what line would they have taken? Would they not have tried to influence the German group mind to give up its militarist ideals and concentrate on the League of Nations? Was it not more than likely that our Indian friend was trying to disabuse us of our imperialistic tendencies? Would it not appear to him, smarting as he was under the race prejudice of the white man, that the world would be a much better place for humanity if the English cultivated their own garden and let other people alone? I got more and more uneasy, and X, being a good psychic, detected my uneasiness, and I was asked to withdraw from the group he was organizing. I felt quite convinced that something sinister was being attempted against the group mind of my race, but I had no means of gauging its extent or potency. This was not the kind of tale one could take to Scotland Yard. Moreover, several of my personal friends believed in the bona fides of X and were taking part in the group he was organizing, and I was very anxious not to involve them in any unpleasantness. In my perplexity I resolved to do nothing upon the physical plane and to invoke the masters upon the inner planes. At this time I was not of a grade which is supposed to have direct access to the masters, but I determined to try and get them telepathically, though I did not know whether those to whom I was trying to telepath were human or non-human, incarnate in physical bodies or discarnate entities, for at that time I was not very advanced in my occult studies. All I had to hold on to was an abstract idea and the knowledge that in previous difficulties I had been able to get in touch with something on the inner planes which had proved a powerful friend. In telepathing, the usual method of getting in touch is to visualize the person you want to communicate with and call him by name. I had nothing I could visualize and I knew no names. However, I determined to make the attempt as best I might and, metaphorically speaking, I put my head out of the window of this fleshly tabernacle and called for the police. And I got an answer. The inner voice replied to me very clearly and distinctly. You are to go to Colonel Y. I was taken aback at this, for Colonel Y was a rather eminent person to whom I had once been introduced, and the last person in the world one would invite to go mare's nesting. I had no desire to make myself ridiculous by bearding this formidable warrior in his den. My psychological studies had made me familiar with the workings of the subconscious mind and what it can do when dissociated, and I felt that the situation required handling with considerable caution because the results of a misstep might be unpleasant. I therefore replied to the inner voice, I cannot trust you unless you will give me a sign. The reply came through, Colonel Y will be at our next lecture. Tell him then. To this I replied, I know that Colonel Y cannot be at my lecture because his regiment is ordered abroad, and he will have left before it takes place. The answer came back, Colonel Y will be at your next lecture. Very well, I said, that shall be my sign. If Colonel Y is there, I will tell him, and if not, I shall leave the affair to take its course. The day duly arrived when I was to give a public lecture at a certain town. I arrived at the hall in due course, and the first thing I saw was Colonel Y going up the stairs. So I determined to take the bull by the horns, and immediately after the lecture I went straight to him and said, I have got a message for. I know you have, he replied, for I have been told to expect it. It appears that he was sitting in his quarters one evening with his 2 dogs. They suddenly became disturbed and began to investigate something that wasn't there. He heard a voice saying distinctly to his inner ear that I should come and ask his help and that he was to give it. He was so impressed by this occurrence that he went to a mutual friend and asked her whether I was in trouble of any sort. At his request she wrote to me to inquire how I was faring, but mentioned no names, and I, not realizing the significance of the incident, returned a non-committal answer. He heard my story and told me to leave the matter in his hands, which I did. This is a queer enough story of coincidence, but the sequel is even queerer. After leaving Colonel Y, I inquired once more of the unseen whether I should take any further steps. The reply came through that for the present I was to do nothing, but that I would be told when further action was to be taken. I learnt afterwards that X had left the country a few days after my interview with Colonel Y. Nothing happened for about 5 months. And then one evening when I was sitting over my fire in the dusk I distinctly heard the inner voice telling me that now was the time to make a move in the matter of X, and that I was to go to Mr. Z and tell my story. Now Mr. Z was a very eminent person indeed, whom I knew of as being an advanced occultist, but whom I had never met. I replied to the interior voice that for me to approach Mr. Z was impossible, I should merely be shown the door, and that unless they could open up the way from their end, I did not see how it was to be done. The answer came through very clearly that the way would be made plain. And it was. A couple of days later a visitor was announced, an old friend whom I only saw occasionally, and after the usual greetings and exchange of news, he said, I should very much like you to meet a friend of mine who I think would be interested in your work. May I take you to see him? His name is Mr. Z. Needless to say I agreed. When I came to the appointed meeting, I said to Mr. Z, after I had been introduced, I have got a message for you, thinking I might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. He listened attentively, and when I mentioned the name of the Indian, my friend who was present, exclaimed, it is a curious thing that you should be moving in this matter at the present moment. X landed in England a couple of days ago. It will be noted that as soon as X left England, I was instructed to hold my hand, and as soon as he returned after an absence of 5 months, I was instructed to commence action again. Unless we are prepared to pull the long arm of coincidence clean out of its socket, we must conclude that some directing intelligence was at work. This is but one among many instances in my experience. Limitations of space forbid me to mention any more. In addition to the occult police, who function solely on the inner planes, there also exist certain groups of occultists who have banded themselves together for the purpose of combating black occultism. I suppose they give themselves different names, but I do not know what these are. I have always heard them referred to generically as the hunting lodges. Upon various occasions I have skirmished on their flanks and looked on at some lively forays. I imagine them to be organized in conjunction with the occult police, and they certainly possess means of obtaining information which point to cooperation from the inner planes. They appear to possess alliances in unexpected quarters and to be able to pull a remarkable number of strings. What psychic weapons they use I do not know, but upon the physical plane they appear to rely largely upon newspaper exposes, and upon keeping undesirables on the move, never allowing them to settle down and organize. Knowing what I do of their methods, I have from time to time recognized their sign manual in various transactions for which decent citizens have every reason to be grateful. I came across them in a manner which serves to illustrate the way in which occultists can call for information they may be in need of, and the fortuitous train of circumstances that will supply it. As a young girl, at the commencement of my interest in occultism, I came in touch with an adept whom I soon realized to be on the left-hand path, and with whom I soon severed my connection. Shortly after I broke with him, I was watching a gymkhana in company with some friends, among them a student of occultism, and we began to discuss matters of mutual interest. Impelled by I know not what impulse to confide in him what I had never told a soul, I told him of my experiences with the adept I have referred to. To my surprise he knew all about him. It seems that my new acquaintance was connected with a group of occultists who had taken for their work the hunting out of black lodges. They had already crossed the trail of my black adept and had compelled him to close down, and he had sworn not to reorganize his order. They had had reason to believe recently that this oath was not being kept and that he had again organized a lodge and was working his rituals, but they did not know where to lay their hands on him. Then here came I, a bit of human flotsam tossed up on a sports field to give them the information they needed at the very moment when they needed it. These things happen too regularly in occultism for one to be able to look upon them as chance. It is my belief that it is possible for anyone who has need of them to get into touch telepathically with this occult police force. The symbol I was taught to use was a black cavalry cross with circle on a scarlet ground. This is pictured in the imagination, and while gazing at it mentally the call is sent out into the unseen, projecting it from the center of the forehead. Various attempts have been made to prove that the occult fraternities are all directed from a single headquarters, said variously to be situated in Germany, Tibet, Mongolia, and South America. Personally I do not believe it. I suppose that I have a pretty varied acquaintance with the inner workings of the occult movement, and I have never seen anything whatever that indicated any centralized control, whether for good or for evil. Everything, in fact, points the other way, and indicates that there is no connecting link save that of a common literature, a common idealism, and a set of symbols which, if not common to all sections, are readily translatable by means of well-understood equivalents. The position in the occult field is analogous to that of Protestant Christianity, not Roman Christianity. Occultism has no pope. Nor do I think that Bolshevism ever gained any foothold in the lodges, though I believe it tried, as witness the application to my own fraternity. The average occultist is not interested in politics, his concern is with things invisible. Moreover, the occult fraternities are too uncoordinated and scattered to be formidable political weapons even if they were imbued with Bolshevism. It has also been said that the occult fraternities are controlled by the Jews in the interests of Zionism. This is quite untrue. There are very few Jews in the occult movement. It is true, however, that the Kabbalah, the traditional mysticism of the Jewish race, is one of the principal sources of Western occultism, and that any occultist working on that tradition must know at least enough Hebrew to be able to transliterate Hebrew script. The study of the modern mystical Kabbalah is almost exclusively in the hands of Gentiles, and Orthodox Jewish scholars know little or nothing of its literature and nothing whatever of its mystical significance. No one has said harder things of the occult movement than I have, and if I thought that there were any organized system of evil influence, I should not hesitate to say so, for I have the integrity of the movement very much at heart, but I honestly do not believe that there is any generalized organization of the occult movement, whether for good or evil, whatever may be one's conception of good and evil. One can, of course, only speak of that which one has seen, but I think it would have been impossible for me to have been as intimately associated with that movement as I have been and never to have crossed its trail at any point. I have crossed so many trails, and seen, I will not deny it, so much that was evil, but this particular evil I have not seen, and I do not believe it exists outside the imagination of people with bees in their bonnets. The true nexus of the occult movement is devotion to a common ideal, but this ideal is approached by an infinite diversity of paths, as many as the breaths of the sons of men. I am sorry for the hypothetical person who has the task of organizing the occult movement, for occultists of different schools cannot be induced to cooperate. Any technique which differs from that which they are used to is suspect, any unfamiliar contact is black. The great majority of the heads of schools that I have known have sat each in his own circle of light and damned everybody else. Like the old lady who watched her son march past with the territorials, they exclaim, "They're all out of step except our jock." I had once dreamed of a federation of occult societies with an annual convention, but I soon realized that it was unworkable. If occultists cannot be got to organize to serve their own interests, it is very unlikely that they would ever be got to organize to serve anybody else's. The most prevalent abuses of Western occultism are immorality, drug-taking and the bamboozling of silly women. Its worst faults are credulity, a slipshod scholarship that verges on illiteracy, and a widespread sappiness of intellect. Fortune-telling in all its forms and some very spurious spiritual healing constitute another slur upon what should be holy ground. It is difficult to do justice to ideals which one does not share, but it has always seemed to me that the highly colored humanitarianism with which certain sections of the movement are soaked is not an ornament. By their fruits ye shall know them. Such fruits of this as I have seen have appeared to me to be somewhat overripe. The finest minds in occultism are totally unknown outside their own orders. A very common clause in initiation oaths binds the candidate not to reveal the names of his fellow members. If this oath were broken, the general public would get some surprises. Occultism not being in good repute with the general public, men in public positions cannot afford to have their names associated with it, their interest is therefore carefully concealed, and they only speak of it to those upon whose sympathy and discretion they can count. Those who know what to look for, however, can pick them out readily. Anyone who is accustomed to the analysis of literary style can detect the regular reader of the Bible. Anyone who knows the occult rituals will detect their flavor in the literary or oratorical style of a man who is habituated to their use. Perhaps at this length of time I may be forgiven if I break the oath of the mysteries that binds to secrecy concerning the names of initiates and suggest that the key to the Bacon-Shakespeare controversy may lie in the fact that Bacon and Shakespeare were members of the same order. Conclusion. In the preceding pages I have endeavored to discharge a difficult task, one that it is almost impossible to discharge satisfactorily. Limitations of space prevent me from explaining my concepts step by step and offering proofs thereof. To have done so would have required a library, not a book. I have had to presume in my readers not only an acquaintance with the literature of occultism but, what is much rarer, some experience of its practice. At the same time I have endeavored to offer sufficient explanation as I went along to make my pages comprehensible to those whose acquaintance with the subject is but cursory. This book is not, and cannot be, a satisfactory handbook for the treatment of psychic disorders. All it can do is to point in directions where inquiries might be pursued with advantage. If it serves to direct attention to certain subjects that badly need investigation, it will have fulfilled its purpose. I may be charged with having revived the superstitions of the Middle Ages. To this charge I must plead guilty. But I must put forward as a counter-claim the plea that there could not be so much smoke without some fire, and that the superstitions of the Middle Ages may repay examination in the light of the recent discoveries concerning the psychology of subconsciousness. Whoever is familiar with the literature of psychic research, abnormal psychology, and the baser aspects of that movement which took its rise from the inspiration of Christian Science and spread into 100 uncontrolled cults, cannot fail to be struck by the fact that the old witch-finders were getting exactly the same phenomena as we meet within all these different movements and fields of thought. It has been said that since we find the stigmata of hysteria liberally distributed among those unhappy beings charged with witchcraft, that the witch cult is explained and disposed of. But we may find that a study of the real motives underlying the witch cult would throw light on hysteria and the allied mental states. It has also been said that history moves in cycles. At the present moment we are seeing a great revival of interest in psychic and occult subjects. We shall not have to look very much further to find that there are also the very promising beginnings of a witch cult in our midst. Let it be remembered that the cases I have quoted in these pages are from the experience of a single person, and I am by no means exceptional in the range of my experience, though I may be less cautious than most in committing myself to paper. If one dip of the bucket reveals so much, what might not be brought up by systematic dredging? Since my treatment of my subject must necessarily be cursory, I should like to direct the attention of my readers to certain books which throw a great deal of light upon the question from various angles. Not only occultists, but psychologists, alienists, and students of psychic matters owe an immense debt of gratitude to the scholarship of the Reverend Montague Summers and the enterprise of Messrs. Rodker for making available exact and complete translations of the principal books upon witchcraft that were written by the men who were actually concerned in stamping out the witch cult and had first-hand knowledge of its nature. In addition to these, I would direct my readers' attention to Projection of the Astral Body by Muldoon and Carrington, which throws a very interesting light upon the manner in which genuine witches attended the Sabbats. I do not mean by these words to imply that Mr. Muldoon is addicted to wizardry, but he certainly possesses the traditional powers, and if he can do these things at the present day, why could not the witches have done them in days past? At any rate, I do not think there is much doubt that the Holy Inquisition would have paid him the compliment of burning him if he had lived during its heyday. 30 Years with the Dead, by Dr. Wickstead, is another book which gives chapter and verse for personal experience instead of citing authorities and theorizing about them. It is the record of an asylum doctor whose wife is a trance medium, and who made a most remarkable series of investigations concerning the nature of obsessing entities. In Dr. Mall's book on hypnotism, some remarkable phenomena are recorded such as do not find their way into modern books, whether because the investigators are less expert at eliciting them, or more cautious in communicating them, having profited by the experience of the earlier investigators. Some of the earlier books on hypnosis and mesmerism yield some very interesting reading to the psychic investigator. Dr. T. W. Mitchell's Medical Psychology and Psychical Research is another book of value to the student, who should be familiar not only with the signs of psychic attack, but also with the signs of pseudo-attack in order that he may distinguish between them and not be misled into some very uncomfortable errors. To find one has been successfully hoaxed by a lunatic is a humiliating experience. Meyer's Human Personality is of course a classic with which every student of psychic phenomena ought to be familiar. There is an excellent abridged edition available for those who do not feel equal to coping with the 2 massive volumes of its original form. Nichols' Dream Psychology and Heart Psychology of Insanity are 2 exceedingly illuminating little books, both written for the layman and readily comprehensible by him. They throw a great deal of light upon the mechanisms of the mind, and no one should attempt to deal with a psychic attack unless he understands those mechanisms. My own little book, Machinery of the Mind, written under my maiden name of Violet M. Firth, will, I think, be found a useful general introduction to modern psychology. Let us approach the subject of modern witchcraft neither in a spirit of incredulity nor of superstition, but from the standpoint of the psychologist, seeking to understand the workings of the mind and prepared to discover much that had hitherto passed unsuspected. The end. These are the last 4 chapters of Dion Fortune's classic text, Psychic Self-Defense, 1935.